Now, according to the official website, apa.org, the American Psychological Association's Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct, or more simply put, the Ethics Code, consists of an introduction, a preamble, 5 general principles, and specific ethical standards. Now, the introduction is put in there to just discuss the intent, organization, and so on, the basic ideas of the text. The preamble and general principles are put in there just to help you relate and understand what all this stuff is about. And then after that, you have those specific ethics guidelines. And as you can imagine, this text is rather comprehensive, and we simply do not have enough time to go over all of it in this short video. So what we're going to focus on is the ethics code, the part of the ethics code that most directly applies to this course, and that would be Section 8. Section 8 concerns research and publication. So, APA Ethics Code Item 8.1 has to do with institutional approval. So, psychologists must provide accurate information about their research proposals and obtain approval prior to conducting their research, and this is typically done with the help of what we call an Institutional Review Board, or an IRB. Now, institutional review boards, IRBs, are something that you can find in pretty much any institution or agency. It's a requirement nowadays, at least in our country, to have this kind of committee oversight to approve or deny studies from being conducted. Now, it's composed of both scientists and non-scientists, and they examine all kinds of research that involve human participants. And they review that proposal according to 7 criteria. Those criteria include the following: the minimization of risk to participants. So they want to make sure that you are, doing everything you can to minimize any potential for harm. Second one is reasonable risk in relation to benefits. If there are any risks in your study, there's always going to be risks. They want to make sure that the benefits outweigh those costs. Third one is equitable selection. They want to make sure that you're treating your participants fairly and you're selecting them in a fair manner. Number 4 is informed consent. They want to make sure that participants are going to understand what they're getting into before participating. Number 5 is documentation of that informed consent. So you need to explain how you intend to keep track of who participated and exactly what they consented to. Number 6 is data monitoring. So the IRB needs to know how you intend to keep track of all this data you're collecting. And number 7 refers to issues regarding privacy and confidentiality. You have to explain how you intend to keep your participants' data private. So that's APA Ethics Code Item 8.1. APA Ethics Code Item 8.2 refers to that informed consent. So it's specifically about informed consent to research. This is the ethical principle requiring the investigator provide all available information about a study so that the participant can make a rational, informed decision regarding whether to participate in that study. And this typically involves the use of a consent form, which contains all the elements that a participant would need to be aware of in order to make an informed decision. But exactly what you put in that consent form, that informed consent form, is kind of up to you. I mean, there are certain things that you should put in there, but exactly how much you explain and how much you don't explain is kind of up to you. Like, here's just an example of some of the stuff you should include. You should include an overview, where you just explain what the goals of your study are, why you're doing the study, that kind of stuff. You should also describe the procedures you intend to use. So participants should be able to know, what it is that is going to be expected of them, what is going to happen during the study. You should also include a section on risks and inconveniences that the participant might face. So are there any potentials for the participant being uncomfortable or inconvenienced in some way? You should also include a section on any potential benefits the participant might get by participating. Like if they are going to be compensated for their time or anything else, you need to mention that in there. You should also probably include a section onto like costs and economic considerations. Like if you're going to be having your participants come to the laboratory multiple times a week, obviously they're going to have to get there somehow, and that could wind up costing them some money. So you need to just outline those kinds of concerns. And then finally, you should always include a section on confidentiality. You want to explain to the participants which data will be kept private and confidential, and how you intend to do that. Now, APA Ethics Code item 8.3 refers to the informed consent for recording voices, specifically for recording voices and images in research. So it's a separate kind of consent for those kinds of media. Psychologists must obtain informed consent from research participants prior to recording their voices or images for data collection, unless one of these two criteria is met. The research consists solely of naturalistic observations in public places. It is not anticipated that that recording will be used in a manner that could cause any kind of personal identification or harm, or the research design includes deception. In that case, the consent will be taken after the fact. So first you record the person, and then you ask them, after you explain to them what the study was about, then you ask them, can I keep this recording? And if they say no, you have to delete it. So you're still getting consent, you're just getting it at the end instead of at the beginning. APA Ethics Code item 8.4 refers to client, patient, student, and subordinate research participants. So when psychologists conduct research with clients, patients, or students, which is actually pretty common, or subordinates of any kind, psychologists need to take steps to protect the prospective participants from any adverse consequences of declining or withdrawing from participation. Now, this is actually a big deal because in a lot of psychological research, you do have this kind of power imbalance where the participants feel compelled to participate. And that's never a good thing. You don't want your participants to feel like they have to be there and they have to do a good job, because then the data is not going to be good quality and the participants might actually suffer as a result. So you need to take steps to try to avoid that kind of thing. And when research participation is a course requirement, as it is in many universities, or if it's an opportunity for extra credit, that participant has to have alternative ways to meet those kinds of requirements, alternative activities. APA Ethics Code item 8.5 refers to those cases where you don't need to get informed consent. So under certain conditions, informed consent is not required, and it basically comes in two ways. Number one is the research would not reasonably be assumed to create distress or harm and involves one of the following things: study of normal educational practices, of only anonymous questionnaires, or the study of factors related to job organizations. So that's one situation where you wouldn't need informed consent. The other one is if the law says so. Like if the federal or institutional regulations allow it, then it's fine. You just need to make sure that for your specific kind of research, that the law says it's okay to not get informed consent to do that kind of research. APA Ethics Code item 8.6 refers to those cases where you have to offer inducements for participation, and this is actually pretty common. In order to get people into the laboratory and in order to collect your data, you have to make people want to be there. And one common way is to give, students credit for participation or give people money for their participation. And in those cases, psychologists must make reasonable efforts to avoid offering excessive or inappropriate financial or other inducements for research participation when those inducements are likely to coerce participants. And you can see how this could be a big issue. You don't want to make participants feel like you're bribing them. You don't want to make them feel like they need to perform better to earn more money or something like that. So this is actually a big concern. You want to make sure that your inducements match the study's requirements. Now, APA Ethics Code Item 8.7 refers to the use of deception in research, which can be defined as the purposeful withholding of information or misleading of participants about a study. Now, deception is only going to be allowed if its usage is vital to testing the hypothesis in question. And deception comes in basically two forms. What we call passive deception or omission, which is just, not telling the whole truth, or active deception, which is called commission, which is basically just lying. You tell participants something that is not true. So regardless of whether it's active or passive, deception is deception. And if you do use deception, then you're going to have to, prove to this IRB why it's important, why it's necessary. Because if you do use deception in your study, it'll only be allowed if it's absolutely necessary to test your hypothesis. Now, APA Ethics Code Item 8.8 refers to debriefing, that post-experimental explanation of the study to the participant, especially if you use deception. So debriefing is common practice. After the study, you just want to explain to the participant what this was all about. What was your hypothesis? What were you trying to find? And so on. But if there is a very good reason to delay or withhold this kind of information, psychologists must take reasonable measures to reduce any possible risk of harm resulting of that withholding. In some cases, you might need to withhold that information, so you just need to make sure that it's not going to be a problem. APA Ethics Code Item 8.9 refers to the humane care and use of animals in research. Psychologists must acquire, care for, use, and dispose of animals in compliance with current federal, state, and local laws and regulations, and with professional standards. Now, a lot of people who, hear about animal research, they tend to criticize it and ask questions like, do we even need to use animals for research? Why should we use animals for research? Well, regardless of whether or not you think animals should be used for research, they have been used for research for over 100 years. And they've been used to test all kinds of different things for various reasons. Like, animal research has allowed us to test many hypotheses to, for example, understand the animals better. I don't know if you've heard about any research on dolphins, but there's been a lot of really interesting research on dolphins and how they communicate. It seems like they have an advanced language system similar to how humans do, but exactly how they use that language is something we don't fully understand. So personally, I think it would be really interesting to learn more about how these dolphins communicate with each other. Another reason why we might use animals in studies is to learn more about humans through comparison. Like, dolphins are neat. I really like dolphins, but I'm more interested in humans at the end of the day. So if we learn something interesting about dolphins, that might actually tell us something about ourselves as well. That's the primary use of animals in psychological research, is to be a model of human behavior. And then one other reason why we've used animals in research is because certain hypotheses either cannot or should not be tested with human participants. And there's a wide variety of reasons why that's the case. So when it comes down to it, animal research has some pros and cons. It has some benefits and some costs. Like, one big benefit, one big pro of animal research is that hypotheses can be tested that are impossible, impractical, or unethical with human subjects. Like if you just think about raising a rat in a cage, most people aren't going to be upset about that. As long as the rat is well kept, it's perfectly fine to raise that rat in a cage. But obviously you can't do that kind of thing with a human. We just have different standards, right? Another big pro to animal research is that the animals themselves might benefit. By learning more about those animals, we may, as a result, learn better ways to relate to the animals and take care of the animals and maybe even help them live longer and happier lives. But perhaps the biggest pro to doing animal research, one of the big reasons why animal research should be done, is that these animals wouldn't exist otherwise. Many researcher animals only exist because of research. Like if we didn't use them in research, they would never be born. So in my opinion, having animals is better than not. Now, one of the big cons is that those animals may unfortunately suffer from participating in the study. Another one is that the study results may not actually tell us much about humans. While it might teach us something about the animals, we won't be able to use those animals as a good model for human behavior. And then a third one is that, raising these animals, breeding these animals for research purposes, it does take a lot of time, effort, and money. So it can be quite expensive to breed and care for the animals used in this research. So obviously, there's a lot of debate regarding this issue, but whether you're for animal research or against it, the fact is it's being done, it's going to continue being done, and I don't really see any change in that in the near future. Animals have always been a part of psychological research, and they'll probably continue to be in the future. But the good news is things have changed regarding how animals are taken care of. Nowadays, we have what are called Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees, IACUC. These are committees that examine all proposed research with respect to its treatment of non-human subjects. This is basically like an IRB, but for animal participants instead of humans. And every institution that receives federal funds to do animal research has these committees. So these committees, just like an IRB, these committees are going to make sure that the animals are not suffering unnecessarily and that the experimenters, the researchers, are taking every step they can to try to make sure these animals are being treated fairly and humane fashion. Now, moving on to APA Ethics Code Item 8.10, the reporting of research results. It's important that psychologists report only the facts. They do not fabricate their data. If psychologists discover any errors in their published data, it's important that they take reasonable steps to correct those errors in a correction, retraction, erratum, or other appropriate publication means. To put it simply, researchers need to make sure that what they're putting out there in their research reports is accurate. And if it's not, they have to fix it. But unfortunately, a lot of stuff isn't fixed. A lot of bad science is put out there and left out there. And that's what we call fraud. Fraud refers to this explicit effort, this intentional effort of a researcher to falsify or misrepresent their data, and it typically comes in one of three kinds. The basic kinds of fraud include using questionable methods. This may not really seem like fraud to you, but we have certain expectations for different kinds of research. And if you publish a certain kind of research and you're not doing what everybody thinks you're doing, that could be considered fraud. You're trying to trick people. You're trying to manipulate people in that way. Another kind of fraud that we see is the misrepresentation of data. Thankfully, this is often done accidentally, especially with newer researchers that aren't too good when it comes to data analysis and stuff. This just refers to when they report their data in ways that are not the best, ways that could potentially be misleading. And this does unfortunately happen quite a lot. But by far the most serious and the most, horrible kind of fraud in science is the fabrication of data, the outright creation of data to support your hypothesis. Thankfully, this doesn't happen very often because the consequences of being caught fabricating your data are so severe that it tends to scare people away from doing this kind of thing. And that's one of the big safeguards we have against fraud. But we'll come back to that. You might wonder why researchers would do this kind of stuff if the consequences are so serious. Well, there's actually very good reasons. One is that, like many professions, people need to be competitive. Researchers need to compete to achieve more prestige and get more grants from the government so they can do more research and so on. Researchers who don't have this prestige, they're just not going to be finding much work in the future. And in a much more, day-to-day sense, another reason why researchers might commit fraud is that we have a system built where they have to get good published research reports in order to keep their jobs and to advance in their career ladder. There's a phrase that we use called publish or perish, and that's exactly what it sounds like. If you're not publishing, if you're not doing good science and getting it into good journals, then you're going to find yourself out of a job pretty soon. But there's another reason. There's a third reason why researchers might commit fraud, and it's pretty simple. They have a financial incentive. They're trying to make money. It is unfortunately the case that sometimes researchers are bribed. Some researchers work for a corporation and are incentivized heavily to produce results that support that company's agenda. So that does happen sometimes, and that's obviously a pretty terrible case of fraud. But as I said, there's safeguards against this. We have that harsh consequence of, the researcher who's caught doing fraud, them basically losing their job. If you're caught fabricating data, you're not going to be able to get published in any respectable journal anymore. Nobody's going to take your work seriously. Nobody's going to want to fund your research. It's pretty severe. But that's not the only safeguard we have. There's a couple more, like replication. I've mentioned in a previous video that replication is a fundamental aspect to scientific research. If you're going to be doing science, you have to be able to present what you've done and how you did it and what you found to everyone else so that they can then try to repeat what you've done and get the same results. This is a fundamental feature of science, this replication. And this allows us to make sure that there's nothing shady going on. Like if somebody publishes a study and then you try to replicate it and you can't, well, that would suggest that maybe something was going on that we should know more about, right? Like replication is a great way to do quality control in science. But then there's a third way, and this is called peer review. So whenever you want to publish your results, whenever you write up your research report and you send it off to a journal, they're going to send it to people like you, your peers, other scientists in your field. And those scientists are going to critique your research report, and they're going to make a decision. Should this be published or not? And if they say no, they'll typically kick it back to you and you'll have to make certain changes before they review it again. But the whole point here is these reviewers, these peer reviewers, there's usually two of them. These peer reviewers are kind of like the guards against bad junk science getting through to the journal. So it's a very important distinction. Peer-reviewed journals are fundamentally different from non-peer-reviewed journals in this way. Moving on to APA Ethics Code Item 8.11. This concerns plagiarism. The whole idea here is that psychologists should not present portions of another's work or data as their own, even if the other work or data source is cited occasionally. So think about what that says. What that basically is saying is that you need to present your own work. You should not present other people's work. Even if you give it credit, it could still be considered plagiarism. Even if you properly cite all of your sources and make sure that everybody understands this is not your original writing, it could still be a problem. The whole assumption of APA style is that you're presenting something new. You're presenting some original work. So this is already one example of how a lot of people can get kind of tripped up with APA style and plagiarism issues. But like any ethical issue, plagiarism is not simple. It's not like there's only one kind of plagiarism. It can occur to a variety of degrees. And what I see for the most part as an instructor is the kind of plagiarism that doesn't seem very intentional. Like my students will, it seems like at least once every semester, I'll see a paper where there's clear plagiarism present, but the student just doesn't understand what they've done. So it seems to have happened without any real malicious intent. So I'd like to show you something from Turnitin.com. Turnitin.com is a resource that a lot of instructors use, such as myself, to scan papers for unoriginal content. And what you see here is a list of the different kinds of plagiarism that we see. And it goes from more severe to less severe. So the more red color it is, the more severe it is. So at the top left, you see clone. That just refers to when you basically take somebody else's work and you put your name on it. That's obviously plagiarism. That's obviously unethical. And that's not going to be okay in any class for any assignment. But as you go down the list, you see that less and less material is being copied. And then when you get to the right side, near the bottom, that stuff probably doesn't even look like plagiarism to you. And a lot of instructors might agree. Some instructors might agree that those kinds of issues like 404 error and aggregator, those aren't actually plagiarism. But that just kind of illustrates the point I'm trying to make here. Plagiarism is not a black and white issue. It's shades of gray, or shades of red in this case. But the point here is you want to try to minimize the amount of potential plagiarism in your paper by only including your own original work. And I have some advice from my students that I'd like to share with you about how you can avoid any possible plagiarism. So here's what you should do. After you've read your sources, after you've read that previous literature, close that window, shut the book, whatever, just get it away from you. Remove that information from your field of view. Then take a few moments to think about what you've read. 30 seconds to a minute, and just think about it. After that time, then you start writing, and you try to describe what it is you read earlier. When you do this, when you write in this way, you will invariably filter that information through your own mind, and the result will be your own original words, thus avoiding the issue of plagiarism. But don't forget to cite your sources. Even though you're putting it in your own words, those words were inspired by somebody else's work, so you need to cite that source. Moving on to APA Ethics Code item 8.12, this refers to publication credit. So if you do get a paper into publication, you need to take responsibility and credit, including authorship credit, only for work that you've actually performed or to which you have substantially contributed. This might not seem like such a big deal, but I have seen some pretty bad offenses in this regard. I have heard of examples of studies that have been published with 10 or 12 authors, and half of the people did nothing on that study. They just happened to be in the laboratory on that day that it was being, written up. So sometimes this kind of stuff happens. It's clearly unethical, and you need to make sure that if somebody is getting credit for this publication, that they have actually earned that credit. You don't want freeloaders, benefiting from your work, to put it simply. APA Ethics Code item 8.13 refers to the duplicate publication of data. So just like the plagiarism stuff, when it comes to publishing data, you want to make sure you're only putting original work out there. So any data that you include in a research report, the assumption is that it's data you've collected yourself. It is original data. It has not been previously published. And if you do include any discussion of data that has been already published, you need to acknowledge that. There needs to be some proper description of where this data came from and, details as to why it was used. APA Ethics Code Item 8.14 refers to sharing research data for verification. This Ethics Code item refers back to the importance of replication in science. In order to replicate research results, we need to know exactly what you did and exactly what you found. So after research results are published, psychologists must not withhold the data on which their conclusions are based from other competent professionals who seek to verify the substantive claims through reanalysis and who intend to use such data only for that purpose, provided that the confidentiality of the participants can be protected and unless legal rights concerning proprietary data preclude their release. And then finally, we have APA Ethics Code Item 8.15. This refers to the reviewers, those peer reviewers. Now, when you send your paper off to get published in a peer-reviewed journal, it's going to be, reviewed by individuals similar to yourself, individuals working in your area. And those psychologists who review that material, they must respect the confidentiality and the proprietary rights in such information of those who submitted it. To put it simply, you need to be responsible. You need to be mature. If you receive a research proposal or publication or whatever, and you're the reviewer, you need to be a professional about it. Even if it's the worst proposal you've ever seen, you need to be a professional about it. Treat people with respect and do the best job you can possibly do. You want to be fair. You want to be just. You want to treat these other scientists in the way that you would hope they would treat you as well.